Jonathan, you began your career by, starting off in the military, jumping out of planes, blowing things up, and then you eventually got into Harvard Business School and became an investment banker. What are some lessons from your time in the military that stick with you today?
Well, first off, Pete, it's really great to be with you. I appreciate you having me, on your show. I've been following your success, and as you've done more and more episodes, really excited about what you've got, going on, what you're doing. But yeah, to answer your question, look, I had a great experience in the military. I got to serve with some really phenomenal people, and if you look at the window where I served, it would have been hard to pick a better time to serve. And that I was a plebe at West Point in 1993 when the Battle of Mogadishu happened. Now, that was a little bit of a wake-up call, right? For people who don't know, that was the battle that's the story of Black Hawk Down, right? And so we kind of got, first semester plebe at the academy, see that, war is not just something you see on TV, right? It has real consequences. But then the world was pretty quiet through the rest of my time at the academy and the majority of my time serving on active duty. So I served on active duty from May 31st of 1997 until June of 2002, when, as you mentioned, I left to go to business school. So 9/11 happened at the tail end of my military service, and I had already made the decision to get out. So again, I got to do some really great things. As you mentioned, I got to jump out of planes. I got to blow things up. I got to lead some really great people and work on some really difficult, from a military standpoint, missions and tasks. And I think it would be hard to summarize everything I learned in a succinct answer, but things like how to work with people from different backgrounds and simply how to get things done, right? You're given a complex task, and you need to break it down into its component parts. And oh, by the way, you have a very near-term and non-negotiable deadline. And in many cases, of course, in the military, you try to do operations at night because the idea was that the U.S. military kind of owns the night and always is going to have an advantage. So, you really crank up a lot of stress, a lot of requirements. And you have to learn pretty quickly just how to get things done, how to motivate people, how to get everybody on the same page, and actually come out with a real world outcome.
Looking back, what was the most challenging part of transitioning from the military to the investment banking world?
Well, you're probably talking to someone who probably did it. If I'm not the worst at it, I had to have been among the worst. I joke that when I left the military, I didn't even know how to dress myself because I'd been in uniform for, at that point, 9 years. All I owned was like military uniforms and gym clothes. So even just things like, how do you buy a suit? How do you pick out a tie? Those kind of things were difficult. Also, the military is a great place, but you always kind of have someone looking out for you, managing your career or helping you manage your career. It's always up to you. And just understanding that, making that jump, getting out of the military. And by the way, back today, between the military and a bunch of private organizations, there are a lot of resources that are available to transitioning service members. And I've actually been helped with some of those. But those largely didn't exist, or people didn't really use them. They were kind of untested, back then. So there are certainly a lot of challenges. Things like, look, I had to learn a whole new language, go from, engineering and military to learning the language of finance. Learning to work with, for example, when I got into banking, with colleagues who could come in one day and resign. You can't just quit in the military, right? You have an end date to your service, right? So there are a lot of different things. People have different motivations, but again, people are people, and I think you learn how to adapt to the situation and learn how to deal with the people that you're working with.
What initially attracted you to investment banking as a career path?
So great question. I thought I wanted to get out of the Army. I could say I knew I wanted to get out of the Army. After a few years, I had enough of being, cold and wet and doing field exercises. And by the way, those were a lot of fun up front, but I got to a certain point where I didn't want to do that anymore. I'd always assumed I'd go to law school. And then I actually found a website that introduced me to investment banking. I didn't know investment banking existed. I think I'd heard of it, but didn't have any idea what it really was. But I read this website that may or may not be around today. And they said, in investment banking, you work on mergers and acquisitions and IPOs. And I said, that's what I want to do. So, and you got to remember, this is in the dial-up days. So I saw this on a dial-up website, right? This would have been in 2001. And I found the vault.com, and they offered their guide, the Vault Guide to Investment Banking, in physical format. So I bought it and then had to wait a few weeks for it to get to me. I was living kind of in the middle of nowhere in Missouri. I read the book and I was like, wow, that really is what I want to do after reading into it more. And at the back of the book, I think it was at the back, they had a list of all the banks and also where all the banks recruited from both undergrad and business school. And I kind of made a list together of where I wanted to, where I would need to go, where I wanted to go, where I thought I could get in. And that was sort of what started my journey.
What experiences early in your banking career helped shape the way you lead today?
So, banking's an interesting profession, right? Much like in many fields. In banking, a lot of times what gets you promoted is, efficiency in your job, proficiency in your job, being very good technically, and then ultimately as you get more senior, being very good with clients. That doesn't always translate into the leadership aspects that are needed as you become more senior as a banker. I was very fortunate to have some really great mentors from my time as a brand new stub associate, all the way up. And look, I'm a believer in, and for people who are starting out any career, but especially banking, I always tell people, look around at everybody, right? And think about the type of person you want to be, the type of senior banker, the type of senior leader you want to be, by picking the best characteristics of the people around you and try to get to their level, right? And like in banking, you go in there, you start as a new analyst or a new associate, and you say, okay, who is the best at modeling? I want to model like them, right? Who's the best at formatting? Because I want to format like them. By the way, I never actually followed that advice on the formatting. Who's the best at communicating with the deal team, right? I want to communicate like them. Who's the best at communicating with product partners? I want to communicate with them. So, again, I always try to kind of put it all together. I was fortunate to have, in addition to some mentors, some really great staffers that I worked with. And for those who maybe are new to the banking setup, the staffer is usually a junior vice president or maybe a senior associate who actually assigns, the analysts and the associates to the different deal teams that they'll be working on, and make sure they have the right projects, good number of projects, across varied deal teams. So, tried to look at what they did well, right? Because they're kind of the first real leadership kind of role that you see in banking. Tried to look at my group heads, see what they do well. So, again, it's all about trying to pick the best pieces of everybody and try to bring it all together into kind of the type of person, type of leader, type of banker that you want to be.
As a managing director, responsible for, I think it was around 80 junior bankers and maybe 20 or 30 additional indirect reports. From your perspective, what separates the analyst and associate that thrive versus the one?
So, that's a great question, Mitch. And I had a lot of direct reports. They were in different teams across the country. And, so it was always important to kind of keep up with them, with their teams, with what they're doing. But I always said whether it's for a summer intern or whether it was a senior associate who's trying to make that jump to VP, right? Because these are going to be very, very different people, right? With very different experience levels, very different goals. To me, it all comes down to ownership, right? Because everybody who walks through the doors of an investment bank, everybody's smart. Everybody's got the right education. Everybody's got the right background. Everybody got through a gauntlet of interviews to prove that they have the behavioral skills, they have the technical skills. But something that's really difficult to measure from the outside, but becomes really important when someone gets in on the inside, is that level of ownership, right? If you have someone who just looks at from a standpoint of, I've got a bunch of work to do and I just need to move it from my inbox to my outbox, right? That's fine. You might get the work done, but the people who really own it, who ask the questions, who dig one layer deep, who make sure they truly understand what's going on, who spend the extra time to check their work, to coordinate with the other people that they're working with, to bring up issues, right? To look over the materials one more time, right? To like I said, really just own it and feel like everything that goes out, whether it's a model, whether it's a pitch book, you name it, any kind of document, anything, that it's got their name on it and it needs to be the absolute best work that they can produce. So again, that's why I feel like it's ownership's what really separates people, because again, everybody comes in and they're super talented.
How has your approach to coaching and developing junior bankers evolved during your career?
Yeah, no, it's a great question, because if I kind of think of my coaching, while I've been formally a coach for about 10 months, I've kind of been coaching basically my whole professional career, right? Whether it's going back to my military days, right, where it's often a very narrow focus, right, on leadership or tactics or something like that. I was working with other junior officers or junior soldiers. In my 10 years when I was actually a banker, doing banking deals, I was a staffer multiple times. I was a COO for a brief period of time during some transition. I was a summer staffer. And then, after a short break from the industry, spent 8 years at Wells, where I was managing people directly. And in that role it was much more of a focus of mine, not just something else I did, right? To manage people, manage recruiting processes, do a lot of interviews, recruiting, running the summer program, and things like that. I think something that's important is everybody comes in and they've got a certain job description and they've got certain qualifications, and we've worked really hard to make sure that people have what it takes, right, to succeed in the business. And then we give them additional training and additional tools to make sure they can be successful. But you should never forget that even though they all seem like the same or very similar on day one, people are actually very different. They have very different motivations in terms of why did they come into banking and what do they want to get out of banking, right? And so you have to work with people very differently based on who they are, what their motivations are, what their skills are. By the way, people come in and we think that they have a certain baseline skills, but maybe they become really good in one part of the job, but not so great at another. So how do we work with them to make sure, hey, let's build off your strengths, but let's improve the parts that you need to work on. Many cases I find that what people need to work on is often very much in their control, right? And that's very different than working with someone who doesn't have the skills, doesn't have the ability, right? Often what people might lack if they're having difficulty in an area, maybe it's focus, maybe it's going back to the ownership that I've talked about before, maybe it's the communication. So I'm a big believer in making sure that people control what they can control, right? There's a lot of things we can't control. We can't control the markets. We can't control clients. We can't control the senior bankers, product partners. We can't, here in Houston, we definitely can't control commodity costs and commodity prices. But what we can control is our effort level, we can control how we show up. We can control when we show up, right? We can control what type of team player we are. We can control whether we check the model one more time, whether we check the book one more time. We can control how and when we respond to the email from a senior banker saying, hey, what's the status of XYZ? Or can you help with whatever? So that's sort of the foundation of how I kind of look at things is let's control what you can control.
What are some of the biggest misconceptions that students and career changers have about investment banking?
Wow, great question. And there are certainly many. And it's interesting because when I start to work with someone, the first thing I ask them, or one of the first things I ask them is, why do you want to be an investment banker? Now we'll come back to that because that's one of the key questions that you sort of have to be prepared to answer in an interview. But stepping back from an interview ready answer, it's like, why do you want to be an investment banker? And just like, you see a range of different personalities, there are a lot of different reasons that somebody might want to get into banking. It could range from they don't even know what it is, right? When I tell people that investment banking is neither investing nor banking, some people are really surprised to hear that, right? That they think it's maybe investment management or something on the buy side. So sometimes you just have to, it's just a definitional issue. And I think the next biggest misconception, I think, is how hard the recruiting process actually is, right? People don't really grasp. Well, some people obviously have a very strong grasp on it, but there are a lot of people out there who don't realize how competitive banking is. Banking is super competitive. It's a great business. Consequently, there are a lot of people looking to get into it, right? It requires a lot of technical skills, a lot of interpersonal skills. And then quite frankly, there's a little bit of just knowing how to play the banking recruiting game. And while it shouldn't necessarily be that way, it is. And we have to react to the game on the field. I don't think people understand how much they truly need to understand the role of the analyst or the associate or whatever role it is that they're trying to get. They also don't really understand the role that networking plays in getting your first job. And I think it's kind of ironic that we're talking about it because I think that's how we got connected 7 or 10 years ago, right? People don't really understand how much investment you need to make in your own candidacy, right? In terms of making sure that resume is perfect, making sure your LinkedIn is in a good spot, making sure you have a good networking plan, making sure you know the right banks to network, the right people to network with, And by the way, I wish someone had told me this when I was a candidate coming out of business school, because my first year I was among the worst candidates probably ever. I did get better in my second year, and that's how I ultimately did finally get a job in banking and make that transition.
What qualities do successful candidates demonstrate in the recruiting process outside of the technical skills that help make them successful?
Yeah, great question again. I think going back to the networking, I think it's really important to talk to a lot of banks and talk to a lot of people at the different banks so you understand the banks, you understand the teams, you understand the role much better, you understand the different models that certain teams use, certain staffing models, et cetera. And when I was in my last role, and I would do a lot of calls with candidates, and I recognize there's a time phase to this, because early in a recruiting cycle, people are going to ask very basic questions because they don't know, right? And then they're just trying to learn. As they go on, their questions get better and better. But what I felt like from my position was someone reaches out, they've got an impressive resume, got a good story, got a nice clean email requesting a call, right? So it kind of points to their business communication. But if we get on the call and I say, hey, so kind of tell me about who you are and where are you in the process and what are you looking to do? And if they have a really good answer, right? Kind of that elevator pitch. Well, I automatically know, okay, they're serious. And then if they follow that up with some questions that show they've done a lot of research and that they've talked to people and they're forming their ideas in their head and they're putting it together, and now they're asking me questions because they heard from 3 people that it's a certain way, but they like my perspective on maybe why, or could it be different, and really trying to understand and not just listen to ask the next question, but really listen to understand and follow that conversation. And so maybe, if you don't mind, Pete, I'd love to give just sort of a tip for anybody listening to this who might be doing networking, whether it's for banking or something else, which is a lot of times people will come in and they'll have a list of questions. When I say come in, it could be virtual, it could be in the office. And in some cases, their questions are so specific that they could become a slave to those questions, right? But their goal is not necessarily to have every single question get answered, right? This isn't a final exam. The goal is to establish a relationship, right? And to demonstrate that you're serious about the bank, you're serious about the role, and that you really want to learn and you really want to improve your knowledge of what's going on. So, and again, and when you talk to people, some people can be very different. Some people, you get on a call with them and they just say, okay, so what are your questions? Well, okay. I guess I probably skipped a step, which is don't necessarily have a bunch of questions, but topics, right? I encourage people to have topics, right? And then you go, okay, start with your favorite topic, right? If they say, hey, what are your questions? Start with your favorite topic. But what you really want to do is let that banker kind of take the conversation a little bit where they want to go until they turn it back over to you, and really listen to understand, not listen just, for when they stop speaking so you can ask the next question. Because remember, the goal is you want them to see you as a future colleague, right? Or at least someone that they'll say, hey, you know who you really need to talk to next? You really need to speak to so-and-so. Let me set that up for you. Let me connect you to this person. They'd be a good person for you to talk to. So,
what advice would you give to candidates who are trying to break into the investment banking from a non-traditional background?
All right, so there are two kind of parts of that question, right? Or 2 different ways you can go with that question. Number one is if they have, when we say non-traditional, I can think of like maybe non-traditional school, right? Perhaps they're not studying finance or accounting or business. Or maybe they go to a school that they think is like a non-target sort of school, right? So that's sort of one area. And then the other area is they're in another profession, right? And then they want to get into banking. And by the way, I see candidates, like this all the time, right? So if you go to so for anybody out there who goes to a non-core school, or maybe you go to a core school, but you're not in the business school, you absolutely can break into investment banking, right? It's just have to understand, the dedication that it's going to take, right? Because if you were to go, let's reverse it. If you were to go to a core recruiting school, right, and you have the right major or one of the right majors, well, then you have a lot of things already at your fingertips, right? You have, first of all, your courses, and most schools have shifted their curriculum to account for the banking timeline. All right, you have a club network, you have the alumni network, right? You've just got a lot of things that are sort of, at your disposal. You don't have all of that if you're from either a non-core, if you're at a non-core school, you have potentially none of that or nearly none of that, right? And if you're studying a non-business major at a core school, you kind of have some of it, right? And so it's up to you as a candidate to make up that gap, right? Can you be affiliated with a club? Can you be affiliated with another school's club, right? The benefit of clubs have resume books that they often send to banks. They have guest speakers who are banks. They have banks who come and present. They sponsor treks to the big banking cities, right? So again, as much as you can do to make up that ground, right? And it may be some stuff on your own. It may be you have to do more self-study, right? Maybe you have to because you don't have those. Well, the finance club is going to get together, and we've got a former analyst from so and so that's going to come walk through technicals. Well, you got to learn. You got to go out. You got to be a little creative, right? Whether it's different online courses, and there are a lot of free resources out there. Online courses, videos, a lot of ways that you can do self-study. A lot of books and guides and things out there. Also, you need to really crank up the networking, because if you're not from one of the core schools, or you're not from one of the key majors, it's going to be hard for your resume to stand out. And so you need to have done that networking ahead of time, so that you're not just one of several hundred resumes that come into a pile that someone has to sift through, right? You now come recommended by several people who say, hey, this candidate may look non-traditional, but we want to give them a shot. We think they deserve a first round or something like that. Now let's shift a little bit to the other side, which is someone who maybe has spent a few years not in banking, and they want to get into banking. So the easy answer that a lot of people come to is just go back to school and get an MBA, and then get into banking as an associate. And for some people, that's the right thing. That was the right path for me, right? After 5 years in the Army, I needed that 2-year transition, kind of personally and professionally. Plus, I needed to learn, the skills that I would need, on the job, right, as a banker. For other people, there could be different paths. If you're a little newer in the career, depending on how close your current role is to banking and finance, right, you may be able to move over as a lateral hire, right? People from corporate development, people from accounting, other FP&A and other internal finance roles, often try to do this, and in some cases successfully. There are a lot of different ways, and some of it's fact and circumstance dependent based on the candidate. But often, there can be a path that you can find, into the business. Now, the frustrating part about lateral hiring, and a lot of people have kind of trouble when they start to go down their journey of what do I need to prepare, is that lateral hiring by its nature is a bit unpredictable. Right? You kind of know about when the roles are going to get posted, but not always. As compared to university recruiting, where you pretty much know exactly when resume drops are going to open up, when coffee chats are, when presentations are, when treks are. It's a very well laid out process. So I equate lateral recruiting and preparing for it to, it's like preparing to run a race. And you kind of know the distance, but you don't know the course or the start date. But you got to get ready. And you always have to be ready, because the role might get posted next week. It might be next month. It might be in 6 months. And I think for a lot of people that can be very frustrating. They're like, wait, I'm ready today. Where's the posting? I want to interview today. I'm ready. Well, hold on. Your preparation has to meet the opportunity that the market's presenting.
What are some common mistakes you see candidates make during the networking process?
Kind of going back to the conversations we were talking about, I think not doing their homework and not understanding kind of what the role is. I think, look, networking is incredibly important. And on one hand, there's the interpersonal skills of, do people like you, right? And are you a likable person? Are you the kind of person somebody wants to sit next to, right? In the bullpen. But there's also, people are gauging, like, what kind of candidate are you, right? Are you serious about this? Or are you just kind of like coming here for the, you come to this networking event for the drinks and to hang out and maybe kind of test drive it, right? The bankers want to spend their time with the most serious candidates, right? And really understand those candidates the best. So that to me is probably the biggest the biggest thing. The other thing I will tell you, I see some people in networking try to oversell, right? While technically every interaction is an interview and you should treat it that way, going to a networking event or a coffee chat or maybe a breakout session after an on-campus presentation and trying to sell yourself, I think that strikes people as a little bit, a little bit transactional. I think you really want to kind of go with the flow, go with the conversation, ask good questions. I think there's also this misconception that a good question is maybe a question that they've never heard before or that's really going to stump them. Ask questions that show you've done some homework and that you're interested in the group. And get the people you're talking to talk the most. There's an expression that I'll probably butcher, but goes something like, the more they talk, the more interesting you get. So just kind of keep that in mind.
How has the recruiting process evolved over the past decade, and what should candidates know about today's recruiting environment that's different from the past?
Yeah, it's changed a lot. The headlines are it's moved earlier and it's a lot harder. It's a lot more competitive. A lot more is expected out of you. Especially when you look at the undergrad level, right? So the most common way into banking coming out of undergrad is to do an internship between your junior and senior year. So then you back up and say, okay, well, when do those interviews happen for an internship between your junior and senior year? Those actually happen, for anybody who may not be familiar, those actually happen in the January, February timeframe of your sophomore year. So more than a year before the actual internship will take place. And by the way, there are a lot of firms who maybe they have early recruiting programs, or they just want to get ahead of other banks, and they'll actually interview people before that. So imagine you're a first semester sophomore, and you're at least going to be dropping resumes that, oh, by the way, you hopefully have been doing networking with, right? But you might actually even be interviewing for a role that's at this point 18 months away. So you go, well, so now you think about, okay, well, what do you have to have in place, right, to be able to do this? Well, resume drops mostly are like October, November of sophomore year, again, for a junior year internship. Well, when do you need to do your networking? When do you have to have all your preparation done, right, in terms of laying down those foundational elements like the resume, the LinkedIn, the sort of the elevator pitch? When do you need to be working on your technical questions? When you need to be working on your behavioral questions? Well, that means it's moving up really, really quick. So the natural reaction is, oh, well, if they're interviewing earlier, then that means we should expect less out of them, right? Because they haven't had the classes. And that sounds great, but what I will tell you is the standards and the quality of candidates that I've seen over the last 20 years, even though we're interviewing them earlier, they're actually better prepared as first and second semester sophomores, and in some cases, second semester juniors. So you have a lot to learn. You have a lot of people to network with. You've got to do it quickly. You've got to do it efficiently. And that's kind of the real takeaway, is that it's moved earlier and it's gotten harder. And by the way, because of technology, whether it's Zoom or Teams, HireVue, et cetera, banks have an ability to reach a much broader audience of candidates. And so while recruiting used to be, tied to 10, 20, 30, schools that historically placed a lot of people into investment banking, now that talent pool is opened up nationwide. So you have more people and you're competing earlier, you're expected to be at a much higher standard than it was 10, 15, 20 years ago. So now at the MBA level, it's a little different because, we would have about a month. When I got to business school, we had about a month before the recruiting started, and now recruiting starts effectively the day you get to business school. Business for the MBAs, their interviews tend to be January, anywhere between November to January, depending on the school, of their first year for that internship between their 2 school years. The thing that gets tricky with the MBAs is that most of them are career switchers. So they might be learning accounting, finance, economics, and things like that for the very first time. And that's certainly the bucket I fell into. We had a little bit more time to prepare, but it's, again, going with that theme of it's moved earlier and it's gotten more competitive.
When you're coaching candidates, what adjustments have you seen that typically produce the greatest improvement in their interview performance?
Oh, wow. Great question. I think if I could just bucket, let's talk about behavioral versus technical. So from a behavioral standpoint, I don't think people understand sometimes how short an investment banker's attention span is, right? So we go back to the tell me about yourself, the elevator pitch. Most people will tell you have about 90 seconds. My experience is you probably have less. And I don't think people really understand when they think about all the things they want to cover in that tell me about yourself, sometimes called walk me through your resume. I don't think they understand how succinct you have to be to tell that story and make the right points, in about 60 to 75 seconds, and not go off on a tangent and not have the banker lose interest. So there's a lot about simply how you tell that story, making sure that in every answer, you have to tell the most important thing first, right? And you see this, I find most commonly in comparison questions, right? Why do you want to be a banker instead of doing consulting, right? Or something like that. You don't have much time. So you got to think about, okay, I've got some points I need to make. This person's likely to cut me off. What's the most important thing I can tell them? Well, the most important things you can say is, why do you want to be a banker, right? And then you can kind of go to the other, maybe if you did consulting, you might want to talk about, look, I've done consulting, I've had a great experience, and here are the skills I learned that transfer to banking. But here's what consulting lacks. And oh, by the way, banking has all those things that consulting lacks, right? So again, if you think about structuring your answer that way with the most important thing first, right? Then anytime you get cut off, they've heard your strongest argument, then your second strongest argument, then your third strongest argument. So I think just being able to be efficient. I know this is something I suffered from a lot when I was a candidate. People would say, tell me about a time when, right? And I wish I knew that the star format sort of existed, right? In terms of how to tell a story. People loved hearing stories about jumping out of planes or blowing things up. And by the way, it's a lot of fun to tell a really long story about something like that. It's very comfortable. I felt like I was an expert in it. I was generally the only one in the room that had ever done either of those, much less both. But if you spend 5 minutes having to tell the background on a story, well, you might have wasted some really valuable time in an interview, right? Most interviews are about 30 minutes. So you got some greetings, you try to save some time at the end, you're down to 25, 26 minutes. So you waste even 1 minute, that's a huge percentage. And that's time you're not making positive points, and showing them that you have the skills. So now going to the technical side, right? So that's the behavioral side. Going to the technical side, I think it's really with the technical, it's really about putting in the work, making a plan. You have to learn the 400 guide, make yourself a plan, hold yourself accountable, but making sure that you understand it, that you're not just regurgitating question and answer. Because, in a first round, a definition question or a walk me through question probably will be okay. But you get to that final round, they're going to really test your understanding, right? Because they're going to have to distinguish between multiple different, very qualified candidates. So you want to be able to show that you really have a mastery of the subject. You also don't want to be the kind of person who can answer the straight on question. But if we just change the question a little bit, They just get totally flustered. So, and I've seen that, as, as an interviewer. I've seen that as an interview coach. I've actually had at least one I can think of off the top of my head. I'm sure there are others who said, I want you to ask me a lot of technical questions, but different than you usually get them. And that was actually a really fun session. And I think both of us learned a lot during that session.
What separates those candidates who merely get an offer, then work in banking for a relatively short time, from those who have a long, successful career in investment banking?
Yeah. So, going back to the motivations, right? Part of it is, why does somebody come into banking? Because if someone comes into banking because maybe they come in at the analyst level and they say, I want to do my 2 years because this is the best way to private equity, which is very common these days, or a hedge fund, or the buy side, or I want to go start a business, but first I want to get some experience, learning how businesses think and, gaining a lot of skills, right? Well, that person, they're going to leave and they're probably going to go off and do great things, and we celebrate that. And they're going to leave. They could be a really strong performer, and you say, hey, we would love for you to stay for a third year. We'd love for you to stay and be an associate. But they're like, look, I appreciate that. That's great. I've had a phenomenal experience here, but my goals are elsewhere, right? And that's okay. And part of a bank's recruiting effort is showing people, hey, if you come here and you do your 2 years and you do a good job, here are the things that are possible for you. Then you get other people who come in who want to make banking a career. You see that much more often at the associate level, right? But for every class of associates, they can't all become vice presidents, and there are a lot of things that will happen along the way, right? In some cases, maybe they say, this isn't for me. Maybe they want a different work-life balance. Maybe they find an opportunity with a client or on the buy side, that they like better. And then you get some who truly want to stay on and make the transition. What I think is interesting about banking is, if you look at each level builds off the previous level, right? So analyst to associate, associate to VP, et cetera. But your focus changes. So you have to have mastered each level before you can go to the next one. But simply, if you are, and I would spend a lot of time talking to our analysts who are getting promoted to associate and say, look, you can be the best analyst in this group. In fact, you already are. That's why you got promoted to associate. But your goal now as an associate is to be the best associate in the group, right? And don't just your answer to everything. Look, you're the fastest. You've done everything in the group. You know the clients, you know the people. You know how things work. Your solution can't be to just do it yourself, because you're always going to be faster, right? You're always going to be faster, better, more accurate than the new analyst. You need to be an associate, right? You need to think like an associate. You need to be thinking more strategically. You need to be thinking about training analysts. Don't throw away all those skills you learned. Those are incredibly valuable, but we want to expand those and change your focus. And so again, going back to the person who stays in a long time, as they get more senior in their particular role, the foundational skills of that role are down pat, right? They just have it, right? There's no question whether they have the technical skills, communication skills, or whatever it is. And before they get promoted, remember, the easiest way to get promoted in any role, in any job, is to have people see you already doing that job. So if you're a senior analyst and you're taking on associate work, okay, well, that's a great way to get promoted to associate. Same thing from associate to VP. I would tell the senior associates, your job is to make the VP irrelevant, but for the right reasons, not because you're excluding them from emails or going around their back, but because by the time they see something that you have worked on and reviewed, it's near perfect. And the only thing they're really going to add might be something that, maybe some information you haven't gotten yet, right? That they might know from conversations you weren't a part of. So again, and it's just, so I kind of go back to, it's that ability to make sure your skill set's solid at each level and then be able to adapt to the requirements of the new level, which can often be very different.
How should young professionals approach the process of finding good mentors and sponsors?
Mentors, I think, are huge. I think it's probably something that everybody talks about, but people don't put enough emphasis on. I was very fortunate throughout my career in the military, plus in banking, plus actually my last role at Wells, kind of in a management role, to have some really great mentors. I believe you have to seek them out. In many cases, when you join an organization, maybe it's as an intern or full-time at kind of a junior level, particularly if you're in a training class, you're often assigned a mentor. And I often assign 2 to 3 mentors for summer interns. And the idea there was just to get the ball rolling in terms of starting mentorship. It wasn't meant to be static. Ultimately, when you do good work for people, you work on something hard with someone, you deliver for them, you develop relationships. And if this is a person that maybe is more senior to you, been around a bit, they can become a really good mentor for you. And sometimes mentors kind of feel like they have a formal title, but most of the time they don't. But I think it's important to find good mentors, do good work for them, seek their advice, take their advice. But also, as importantly, is sometimes you outgrow your mentor. And I think it's really important to make sure that if you find yourself outgrowing your mentor, you need to go find a new one. Who's the next person you can work with that can help you stretch, right? They can help you grow. They can help you become a better professional, in whatever you're doing. And I think that's really important. And just, give a very, very simple example. New analysts maybe would hit the desk and they see the senior analysts and they kind of, each one maybe has sort of a favorite that they kind of grab onto. Some of them recognize very quickly who the best are and gravitate towards that. And again, going back to who's the best at modeling, who's the best at formatting, who's the best at communicating, and trying to emulate those. Some people, unfortunately, get stuck emulating the person that isn't so good or maybe has some not great qualities. And if they don't move away from that mentor, quickly and on their own and go seek someone who can actually help them grow, they may end up going down the wrong path of, just having the wrong expectations of what it takes to be successful.
Leadership is a consistent theme throughout your career. What have you learned about leading high-performing teams under pressure?
Yeah, I mean, it does seem like a recurring theme, and I've had the privilege of working with some really great people in the military and banking throughout my career. I think one of the things, and it's something I kind of take into my coaching, which is, here we are, we're just talking, right? It's a weekday morning. We had a good night's sleep, had my coffee this morning, right? It's easy to talk about doing what's hard and checking the book one more time and checking the model one more time and making sure everything is perfect. But when it's really late and you pulled an all-nighter the night before and there's a lot of pressure and you need to get the book printed to get to so-and-so's house so they can get on a 6 a.m. flight, right? That's where it gets really hard. And that's where, the foundations you've set of, this is the way we do things. Here is my checklist. Before I print a book, send out an email, do whatever. Here's what I do. Here's what I go through. And keeping that discipline of, yes, I'm tired. Yes, I get to go home as soon as I hit send on this email. But I do need to make sure that this email is correct. I do need to make sure I have the right attachment. I do need to make sure that the attachment is what I think it is. Et cetera. And again, I think also it's going back to, you really have to understand people, and you have to understand that the people that you're leading and motivating, that they all have different perspectives, they have different wants, and needs. and they have, quite frankly, they have different goals for what they want to be. But what I found in banking is everybody wants to do well on what they're working on today, and the question is, what is that for, right? Is that so that they can get a closed deal on their resume to get into private equity? Is that because they're just trying to learn as much as possible? Is that because they're trying to, they want to make a long-term career and they want to, make sure they do transactions in every sort of sector, right, that they might be covering?
For someone just starting out their career today, what skills do you recommend they should start building immediately?
So banking is a combination, of hard skills and soft skills, right? And I think they're both incredibly important. In banking, the technical skills are must-haves. If you don't have those, you won't succeed in the job. And a lot of the recruiting process, a lot of the interview process is centered on making sure you have those, right? Whether it's phone screens or technical interviews as part of first rounds or super days, those are incredibly important. Also, though, the soft skills, you can't neglect the soft skills. And this is one of the mistakes I made when I was recruiting for banking. I went right for the hard skills. I said, I'm a career switcher. I need to learn all this, valuation, merger math, everything like that. I went too far to the hard skills, and consequently, I didn't get a lot of interviews. So I'm a believer you got to get those soft skills down first, because they're a big part of your networking, and making sure you're getting in the room. You may be the greatest with all your technical skills, but if you don't get in the room because you haven't told your story effectively, you haven't done the networking effectively, your resume is not in good shape, then no one's ever going to know. And by the way, blending soft skills and hard skills is incredibly hard, right? This is, we talk about it like it's really easy, but it's actually really hard. And especially when you're doing that in the context of trying to either start your new career, change careers, or whatever it might be. You think about an MBA student. They're changing careers. They're going back to school. They probably moved. They're learning almost a new language and trying to develop all of these, which hopefully they develop some of those, in their previous career.
As you look ahead over the next 5 years, how do you see investment banking, recruiting, and talent development evolving?
Well, I think it's going to get more competitive. I think the trend is that people are starting earlier and getting to a higher level of preparation even earlier, and I think that's going to continue. People might be surprised to know I'm working with not just working people in sort of that primary zone of the interview prep right now, but I'm actually working with some incoming college freshmen and a group of high school students who are interested in finance. Found me. I'm doing a presentation with them actually this Saturday. So, you can expect that, you can expect that pressure and the expectations to ramp up. At the same time, right, AI is playing a bigger role in kind of everything that's going on. I am not a believer that AI is going to replace bankers in large scale. When I think about the technological advances that have happened since I joined the business over 20 years ago, basically we had FactSet in SEC.gov, and FactSet was not very good back then. But you've seen a lot of data aggregators. You've seen FactSet can do amazing things now. You've got other vendors, other providers. You also see the integration of AI into a lot of the programs that banks use a lot, right? Whether it's Excel, Word, PowerPoint. I think so. Someone who knows how to use those AI tools, of course, within the limits of what a bank or financial institution is going to allow you to do, I think those become important. But I'm also a believer that in a world where AI is going to play a bigger and bigger role, those things that make you human become even more valuable, right? The communication, the coordination, the AI might be better than you at some point at making a model that says the answer is 7, but you still need to be able to say, okay, we calculated the answer is 7, but is 7 good? Is it bad? Should it be 70? Right? And to understand what is that? And so we're knowing that the answer is 7, what kind of position does that put us, put our clients in, et cetera? Again, I think there would just be a premium on those things that make people more human. It's not new that technology it gets faster at a lot of the basic and the repetitive skills. That will always continue. It's always happened. It's going to continue to happen. But I don't think banking is going away. I think AI will probably empower bankers the same way it's going to empower people in all other fields, as well.